The system we have is a wonderful, clean system. From an electricity standpoint and a greenhouse gas standpoint, it's one of the cleanest systems in the world today. It has very few emissions as it currently stands, so there's very little need to transition it into or morph it into something else so that it can be good to the environment from an environmental air standpoint. It's already there. The question is, where are we taking it? What are we doing? And I think we have to ask ourselves: are we talking about future need in British Columbia from a domestic standpoint, or are we talking about exporting our resources so that others in other jurisdictions can begin to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emitting resources? That's a very important question because it goes to the degree of what's required in this province. And I think we haven't really had that dialogue, we haven't had that public understanding of what's driving policy, what's driving the direction that we're going in. Until we grapple with that question, I think the answers are going to be quite elusive.
By moving beyond valley-by-valley conflicts and develop a certain amount of legitimacy behind our resource management frameworks by having a collaborative process that we refer to as the land and resource management process. But the lesson we seem to have taken from that is the long one, that we have this really bizarre disjuncture between what's clearly needed, which is a revised and updated version of that process to address the energy issue, and the view of the provincial government, which seems to be that they don't want to have anything to do with those sorts of processes, that we no longer have the political will or the administrative capacity to undertake such a process. But the provincial government is the only organization that we have that can both convene and lead such a process, and I think it's necessary to do so.
Let me throw out something. There are 49 IPPs operating today. I don't exactly know how many of those are under the river. I think it's about 35. If we were to extrapolate out, how many would we be looking at? It's not the thousands that people talk about. Is it 250? I don't know if that's a bad number or a good number. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of scale. How many are we talking about? And maybe we can bring down some of the hyperbole and start to put together the information systems and do the strategic planning that needs to be done on a sensible level. And again, I get back to, we do need leadership, and leadership from government, from the organizations represented here, from industry that I'm representing.
The molecule of carbon dioxide has zero respect for borders. It doesn't care where it's generated from. So we need to be thinking about, or ask the question, can we use British Columbia's energy resource base to displace the production of carbon dioxide elsewhere? And I think we have an extraordinary opportunity here to at least evaluate that question very carefully.
You know, I grew up in an LRP world and making those kinds of decisions, and it worked well at the time. But we're dealing with things on a much different scale, much more complexity. We need to find new decision-making mechanisms, and I agree with much of this. That we need more transparency, we need more ways to involve people, but we need speed. If we don't start to move very fast on this stuff, we're going to all lose the big battle. And an example of that would be when my counterparts in the NPR come to me and talk about raising the oil and gas production of the province. I shudder from a carbon emissions point of view in this province. But then I do look at, well, we'll allow fuel switching for somewhere else in the continent, in the globe. And those are the kind of levels that we have to examine this question. That combined with a local level, like it's all got to be in there.
So, suggestions of NIMBYism are not really productive nor accurate. Some places are sacred. Some places must be reserved for adaptation. We're way beyond mitigation. Preserving every ecosystem possible is what is going to get us through some of the impacts of climate change. This is not NIMBYism, it's good planning. We've heard about the benefits to communities, to some small communities. What about the impacts of those existing activities in those communities? They're huge. In my community alone, many businesses will be impacted by the Butte project. As far as individual projects, many small projects, First Nation settlements, small communities, small camps, to do Run a River, to get them off diesel, great. Lots of support. We've supported the first tidal power zone on Quadra Island and will support more in appropriate places, appropriate sizes. But the mega projects are about export. And and said, we've not had that conversation yet. Yet we are reviewing projects that are all about export, with no guarantee that fossil fuel use will be reduced and that existing ecosystems will not be destroyed.
I can't stop myself from making one comment about urgency, which is just that if we truly believe that we're living in the climate era and that we're living in a climate crisis, then we need to act like we're in a crisis. And that means that we have to make hard choices, and there's going to be messy solutions, and we're going to have to say that we're going to prioritize something over another thing. And that is incredibly difficult, and there's no question, and it's just going to get harder as we start to feel the impacts. And, you know, having just come from Copenhagen, I have to say that we have the luxury of having this conversation here today because we don't live in Sudan or many of the other places. I mean, I sat next to a man who said, well, it's nice that you get to talk about whether to build windmills. We're trying to figure out how many people are going to die this year because of droughts. So think about that when you're talking about it. And so I just think that we need to add that sense of urgency, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have dialogue and planning, but it does mean that as environmentalists, we have to stop, you know, glorifying windmills and solar panels when it's easy for us, and start talking about what we're for, and not just about what we're against.
Or since we're sitting beside each other, I don't think we're on different pages in terms of believing that we're in a crisis here. And I think that that's worth saying. I think what's also worth saying is that we don't want to make hasty decisions, wrong decisions, destructive decisions. So we can acknowledge that we're in a crisis, but we need to be particularly thoughtful in terms of what our solutions are. If we are looking at, for example, being leaders around energy export in this province, we definitely want to make sure that jurisdictions that we're exporting to are going to be responsible around their commitment to climate change, so that what we're doing is not destroying BC's natural resources, so that we can fill swimming pools in California and help our air conditioning down there as well. I don't think we're off the same, like totally in disagreement around the crisis.
Thank you. I think there are some realities that we have to be very conscious of, and when we're talking about the vision in British Columbia. But BC Hydro is a net importer of power. We don't make enough power in British Columbia. We need to make more power. And the question is, how are we going to do that? And I really think that every region of the province needs to be independent electricity, power generation. There's going to be disasters that happen. And, you know, if Vancouver Island was cut off from the mainland, there was an earthquake, there's not going to be enough power in Vancouver Island to power everybody. And that's, I think, should be a main goal. And when we talk about the regional planning, I think we really need to find ways to do that. And I think that's one of the solutions is, what can we do? And I think that's why IPPs play a wonderful role, because they're innovators. It's not just run of the river and wind and solar.
Climate change, I think we're all agreeing, is a crisis that needs our priority attention. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but there's been no full-on effort at conservation. In BC, we've had a few good initiatives by BC Hydro, but many of the conservation programs have been cut. BC's carbon tax is a good move, but it's too small to be modifying enough behaviors. We need a serious effort to conservation energy, and if we make that, and to increase serious efforts to conserve energy and increase efficiency will have immediate positive effects with no adverse environmental impacts. We can do it now. If we legislate conservation tomorrow, we get an immediate reduction in GHGs tomorrow. On the other hand, if we approve 200 power projects tomorrow, it will be years, even decades, before we actually see overall reduction in GHGs. There's no guarantee that a reduction will even take place.